The slap echoed through first class as 200 passengers watched in stunned silence. The sound cut through the airplane cabin like a knife, followed by collective gasps and the unmistakable click of phone cameras capturing every second. What happened next would turn a routine flight into the most shocking airline incident of the year, and change the lives of everyone on board forever. But to understand how we got to this moment, 30,000 feet above the ground, we need to go back 6 hours earlier, to a story that began with assumptions, escalated through prejudice, and ended with a revelation that no one saw coming. 6 hours earlier, the morning sun cast long shadows across Terminal B at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Among the bustling crowd of travelers dragging suitcases and clutching boarding passes, one woman moved with quiet purpose. Amara Williams, 45 years old, walked through the terminal in simple jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and worn leather boots that had seen countless journeys. To anyone watching, she looked like any other passenger catching a flight to Los Angeles. No designer luggage, no first-class priority boarding pass, no entourage of assistants. What they couldn't see was the weight she carried in her dark brown eyes, a mixture of grief and determination that had become her constant companion over the past 3 months. Amara had recently inherited something extraordinary, something that would make today's events all the more shocking. But she chose to walk among regular travelers, to experience what her customers experienced, because that's exactly what her father had taught her leadership truly meant. As Amara approached Gate C-12, she noticed the subtle but familiar signs of bias that had followed her throughout her life. The gate agent's smile was noticeably cooler when she handed over her boarding pass compared to the passenger ahead of her. The security of her identification was questioned twice, while others sailed through without a second glance. These microaggressions were nothing new, but today they stung differently because of what she now knew about the airline industry from the inside. Meanwhile, in the crew preparation area behind the gate, 32-year-old Jessica Martinez was having the worst morning of her career. As a senior flight attendant with 8 years of experience, Jessica had always prided herself on her professionalism and attention to detail. She was the kind of employee who stayed late, picked up extra shifts, and maintained perfect uniform standards even during grueling double-shift days. But today, everything was falling apart. Her supervisor, Captain Reynolds, cornered her near the coffee machine with a stern expression that made Jessica's stomach drop. "Martinez, we've had 3 customer complaints about your attitude this month. I don't know what's going on with you lately, but passengers are noticing. Corporate is breathing down my neck about service scores, and I need you to step up or step out." Jessica nodded quickly, her throat tight with anxiety. What Captain Reynolds didn't know was that Jessica was drowning. As a single mother to 8-year-old Sophia, she was working double shifts just to keep their heads above water. Behind on rent, struggling with medical bills from Sophia's asthma treatments, and too proud to ask her family for help, Jessica was holding on to this job by her fingernails. As she bent down to zip up her crew bag, a pink envelope fluttered to the floor. Jessica's heart sank as she recognized the distinctive color of her landlord's final notice. 3 days to pay or face eviction. She quickly stuffed the notice back into her bag, hoping no one had seen. But Marcus Chen, the new flight attendant assigned to her crew, had noticed everything. Marcus was 24 years old, fresh out of flight attendant training, and nervous about everything. This was only his 2nd week on the job, and he'd already made 3 mistakes that earned him stern warnings from supervisors. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed the safety procedures one more time, desperately trying to remember every detail of his training. Back in the boarding area, the atmosphere was growing tense. Flight 447 to Los Angeles was already delayed by 45 minutes due to weather in the departure city, and passengers were getting increasingly frustrated. The gate area buzzed with complaints, phone calls to travel agents, and the general chaos that comes with airline delays. Among the agitated travelers was Richard Sterling, a 58-year-old businessman who believed his first-class ticket entitled him to special treatment in every situation. Dressed in an expensive suit and speaking loudly into his phone about incompetent airline staff. Richard was the type of passenger that flight attendants dreaded. His sense of entitlement was matched only by his willingness to voice his displeasure to anyone within earshot. In contrast, the elderly Henderson couple sat quietly near the window, Mrs. Henderson clutching her husband's hand as he reassured her about flying. They'd been married 52 years and were traveling to Los Angeles to visit their new granddaughter. Their patience and kindness stood in stark contrast to the growing irritation of other passengers. Near the back of the seating area, a young mother named Sarah struggled with her crying baby while trying to manage a toddler who was clearly past his nap time. Other passengers shot annoyed glances in her direction, adding to her stress as she juggled diaper bags, bottles, and two increasingly unhappy children. When boarding finally began, Amara watched the process with keen eyes, making mental notes about everything she observed. The gate agents seemed overwhelmed and understaffed. The boarding process lacked organization, creating bottlenecks and passenger frustration. These were exactly the kinds of operational issues she'd been learning about in her crash course in airline management over the past 3 months. As Amara moved through the jet bridge and onto the aircraft, she was struck by how different this experience was from the corporate reports and meetings that had consumed her recent life. This was the real face of air travel. Tired employees, frustrated passengers, and systems stretched to their breaking point. Jessica stood at the aircraft door greeting passengers with her practiced smile, but Amara could see the tension in her shoulders and the forced nature of her cheerfulness. When their eyes met, Jessica's greeting was polite but notably cooler than the welcomes she'd given to previous passengers. "Welcome aboard," Jessica said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she glanced at Amara's casual attire and economy boarding pass. Amara nodded graciously and made her way to her middle seat in row 23, squeezing past a passenger who made no effort to move his legs out of the aisle. As she settled in, she continued her observations, noting the worn seat fabric, the broken reading light, and the generally tired appearance of the aircraft interior. The boarding process continued chaotically around her. Marcus nervously helped passengers with their carry-on luggage, dropping a bag and earning an eye roll from Jessica. Richard Sterling loudly complained about having to wait for people who don't know how to travel properly, while glaring pointedly at passengers struggling with their bags. As the plane filled up, tensions continued to rise. The delay had put everyone behind schedule. Babies were crying, and the air conditioning struggled to keep up with the packed cabin. Jessica moved through the aisles with increasing irritation, her practiced customer service smile becoming more strained with each interaction. It was during the beverage service, about 30 minutes after takeoff, that the first real tension point occurred. Amara, who had been quietly observing the service issues throughout the flight, politely raised her hand when Jessica approached with the beverage cart. "Excuse me, could I possibly have an extra pack of peanuts?" Amara asked with a genuine smile. "I missed breakfast this morning." Jessica's response was curt and dismissive. "Ma'am, we only provide 1 snack per passenger. If you want additional food, you should have purchased something in the airport." The response was harsh enough that nearby passengers noticed, and Amara felt the familiar sting of being treated differently than others. She'd watched Jessica cheerfully provide extra snacks to other passengers just moments earlier, but chose not to argue the point. "Of course I understand," Amara replied quietly, maintaining her composure despite the clear double standard. But Jessica's behavior hadn't gone unnoticed by everyone. Marcus, who was helping with beverage service, had seen his colleague provide multiple snacks to other passengers and was confused by the sudden policy enforcement. The inconsistency made him uncomfortable, but as the newest crew member, he didn't feel he could speak up. What none of them knew was that this small moment of prejudice was just the beginning. The real storm was still building, and when it finally broke, it would reveal truths that would shock everyone on board and change the airline industry forever. Can you imagine being treated differently just because of how you look or where you're sitting? If you're finding this story as incredible, welcome to Mirror Stories, where every story holds a mirror to humanity for truth and justice. Show us some love by clicking the like and subscribe button. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment where you're watching and what time it's for you right now. As Flight 447 continued its journey toward Los Angeles, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly toxic. What started as minor irritations was about to explode into something much more serious, driven by prejudice, stress, and a businessman who couldn't keep his opinions to himself. Richard Sterling had reached his breaking point with what he considered the declining standards of air travel. Seated in first class with his expensive whiskey and sense of superiority, he began voicing complaints loud enough for half the plane to hear. His words cut through the cabin like poison, each comment more inflammatory than the last. "You know what's wrong with flying these days?" Richard announced to his seatmate, though his voice carried far beyond first class. "They let just anybody on these planes now. People who don't understand proper travel etiquette, people who probably shouldn't even be able to afford tickets. It's ruining the entire experience for those of us who actually belong here." His words were deliberately loud, designed to be heard by passengers in economy. The coded language wasn't lost on anyone. When Richard looked pointedly toward the back of the plane while talking about certain types of people, his meaning was crystal clear. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement with his thinly veiled racism. Amara felt every word like a physical blow, but she'd learned long ago not to respond to such provocations. Instead, she focused on something that truly mattered: helping others. When she noticed elderly Mrs. Henderson struggling to retrieve her medication from the overhead bin, Amara immediately stood up to assist. "Here, let me help you with that," Amara said gently, reaching up to carefully retrieve Mrs. Henderson's purse from the compartment. Mrs. Henderson's face lit up with gratitude. "Oh, bless you, dear. These old arms just aren't what they used to be." But Jessica Martinez had reached her limit, with passengers being out of their seats. The stress of the delayed flight, her supervisor's warnings, and her mounting personal problems had pushed her past the point of reasonable customer service. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately," Jessica snapped, her voice sharp enough to draw stares from nearby passengers. "We cannot have passengers wandering around the aisles whenever they feel like it. This is a safety violation." The harshness of Jessica's tone was startling, especially considering Amara was simply helping an elderly passenger. Mrs. Henderson looked embarrassed, and Amara quietly returned to her seat without argument, though the injustice of the situation was obvious to everyone watching. "I was just trying to help," Amara began softly. "Well, don't," Jessica cut her off. "Let the flight crew do their jobs." The incident left uncomfortable tension hanging over the cabin, but worse was yet to come. Marcus, the nervous new flight attendant, was struggling with his second week on the job. His hands shook as he attempted to serve beverages in first class, desperately trying to remember his training while dealing with demanding passengers like Richard Sterling. When Marcus reached Richard's seat, disaster struck. The young attendant's nervousness got the better of him, and as he poured Richard's requested ginger ale, his trembling hands caused the cup to slip. The entire contents spilled directly onto Richard's expensive suit and laptop. "You incompetent idiot!" Richard exploded, jumping from his seat as ginger ale dripped from his clothes. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? This laptop has critical business files on it." Marcus's face went pale with horror. "Sir, I'm so sorry. Let me get towels, I can help." "Get away from me," Richard roared. "I demand to speak to whoever's in charge of this disaster of a crew. You should be fired immediately. People like you have no business working on airplanes." The "people like you" comment hung in the air with ugly implications. Marcus, who was Asian American, clearly understood the subtext, and his embarrassment deepened into something more painful. Other passengers watched the scene unfold, some with sympathy for the young attendant, others nodding in agreement with Richard's explosive reaction. Jessica rushed over to handle the situation, but her own stress levels were making everything worse. Instead of defending her crew member or de-escalating the situation, she was more concerned about another complaint reaching her supervisor. "Sir, I am so sorry about this incident," Jessica said, her voice tight with anxiety. "We will absolutely address this with our crew member and ensure it doesn't happen again." Meanwhile, Jessica's earpiece crackled with yet another message from her supervisor about passenger complaints and service delays. The pressure was mounting from every direction, and she could feel her career slipping away with each new problem. What Jessica didn't notice was that Amara had quietly approached Marcus during the chaos. While Richard continued his tirade and Jessica scrambled to appease him, Amara spoke softly to the shaken young man. "Don't let him get to you," Amara whispered to Marcus. "Accidents happen. I've seen you working hard all flight, and you're doing fine. Some people just like to make others feel small to make themselves feel big." Marcus looked at Amara with surprise and gratitude. In all the chaos, this passenger, someone he barely knew, was the only person showing him kindness. Her words steadied him in a way that all his training hadn't prepared him for. "Thank you," Marcus whispered back. "I really needed to hear that." What neither of them knew was that Amara's response came from deep experience with leadership and crisis management. This moment took her back to a memory from 15 years earlier, when her father had taught her one of the most important lessons of her life. She remembered being 28 years old, fresh out of business school, and frustrated with what she saw as incompetent employees at one of her father's smaller companies. She had complained bitterly to her father about workers who just didn't get it, and suggested they needed to hire better people. Her father, Marcus Williams, had listened patiently before taking her to the warehouse floor. There, he introduced her to employees by name, asking about their families, their challenges, their dreams. He showed her that behind every incompetent worker was a human being trying their best under difficult circumstances. Amara, her father had said that day, "Real leadership isn't about finding perfect people. It's about helping imperfect people become better." The moment you stop seeing employees as human beings with struggles and dreams, you stop being a leader and become just another boss. Remember this: leadership means serving others first, not the other way around. Those words had shaped every decision Amara made in business, and they guided her actions now as she watched Marcus struggle under Richard's verbal assault and Jessica's mounting pressure. But while Amara was quietly supporting Marcus, Jessica was facing her own crisis behind the scenes. During a brief break, she retreated to the small crew area near the back galley to make a phone call she'd been dreading all day. "Hello, Mr. Kowalski? This is Jessica Martinez from apartment 4B, Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know the rent was due yesterday, and I know I promised to have it today. But, Miss Martinez," her landlord's voice cut through the phone like ice, "I've heard enough promises. You have until tomorrow at noon, or I'm starting eviction proceedings. I've got a waiting list of tenants who can pay on time. Please, Mr. Kowalski, just give me until Friday. My daughter Sophia has been sick and the medical bills." "Not my problem," he interrupted. "Tomorrow at noon, or you're out." The line went dead, leaving Jessica staring at her phone with tears threatening to spill. She had nowhere near enough money for rent, Sophia needed her asthma medication refilled, and now she was facing the very real possibility of losing her job after today's disasters. What Jessica didn't realize was that Amara had overheard the entire conversation. Coming back from the restroom, Amara had caught enough of the phone call to understand Jessica's desperate situation. Despite the flight attendant's harsh treatment of her, Amara felt a deep sympathy for a mother struggling to provide for her child. When Jessica ended the call and turned around, she found Amara standing there with genuine concern in her eyes. "I couldn't help but overhear," Amara said softly. "I'm sorry you're going through such a difficult time. Having a sick child and financial pressure at the same time, that's incredibly stressful." Jessica was stunned. After treating this passenger so poorly all flight, here was Amara offering compassion instead of complaints. For a moment, Jessica's defensive walls cracked, and Amara could see the exhausted, frightened mother underneath the uniform. "I thank you," Jessica said, clearly struggling with the unexpected kindness. "I shouldn't have taken my stress out on you earlier. That wasn't professional." It was a moment of human connection that could have changed everything. But before it could develop further, Richard Sterling's voice boomed from first class, destroying any possibility of understanding. "And another thing," Richard announced, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. Look at how they're letting anyone fly these days. You've got people in coach who probably can't afford first class, but they act like they own the plane. It's completely inappropriate. His eyes landed directly on Amara as he spoke, making his meaning unmistakably clear. The racist undertones of his comments hit the cabin like a slap, and passengers began choosing sides. Some looked uncomfortable with Richard's blatant prejudice, while others nodded in agreement with his observations about modern air travel. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just as Jessica and Amara had found a moment of mutual understanding, Richard's poisonous words filled the cabin with tension and divided the passengers along racial lines. The fragile connection between the two women shattered under the weight of mounting pressure and public humiliation. To make matters worse, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with news that would push everyone past their breaking point. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've just received word that severe weather in the Los Angeles area is forcing us to divert to Phoenix for an extended ground delay. We're looking at least a 3-hour delay before we can continue to our final destination. We apologize for this inconvenience and appreciate your patience." The announcement hit the cabin like a bomb. Passengers who were already frustrated by the original delay now faced the possibility of missing connecting flights, hotel reservations, and important meetings. The stress level in the cabin went from high to explosive in seconds. Richard Sterling was the first to voice what many were thinking, but his response went far beyond reasonable complaint into something much darker. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he shouted. "Incompetent crew, substandard service, and now we're stuck with people who have no business being on this flight in the first place." His finger pointed directly at Amara, and suddenly the entire cabin seemed to turn and look at her. She sat quietly in her seat, maintaining her dignity despite being singled out for harassment. But the damage was done. The mob mentality was beginning to take hold, and Amara was being positioned as the scapegoat for everyone's frustrations. Jessica watched this unfold with growing alarm. The brief moment of connection she'd felt with Amara was being poisoned by Richard's inflammatory rhetoric and the mounting pressure of passenger complaints. She could feel the situation spiraling out of control, and her career, along with her daughter's future, hung in the balance. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would change everything. 30,000 feet above the ground, with nowhere to run and tensions at the breaking point, Flight 447 was about to become the scene of an incident that would shock the aviation industry and reveal truths that no one saw coming. What happened next would turn an already tense situation into a complete catastrophe that would be replayed on news channels around the world. The perfect storm of stress, prejudice, and desperation was about to collide in a moment that would change everything for everyone on board Flight 447. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, but this time his message sent shockwaves through the cabin that went far beyond a simple delay announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to severe weather conditions that have developed rapidly in our area, we are declaring an emergency landing procedure. We will be diverting immediately to the nearest airport for an unscheduled landing. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions as we prepare for our descent." The word emergency transformed the cabin atmosphere from tense to terrified. Passengers who had been grumbling about delays suddenly faced the very real possibility that something was seriously wrong with their flight. The emergency landing announcement triggered a wave of panic that rippled through every row. Parents clutched their children closer. Business travelers frantically tried to make phone calls before losing signal, and nervous flyers began hyperventilating as worst-case scenarios flooded their minds. The cabin filled with worried conversations, crying, and the general chaos that comes when 200 people suddenly fear for their safety. For Jessica Martinez, this emergency was the final nail in the coffin of what had already been the worst day of her career. As passengers bombarded her with questions she couldn't answer and demands she couldn't meet, her radio crackled with a message that would push her completely over the edge. "Flight Attendant Martinez, this is your supervisor. I'm getting reports from passengers about unprofessional conduct and poor service management on your flight. With this emergency situation, we cannot afford any additional problems. Handle this situation immediately, or you're facing immediate termination upon landing." The threat hit Jessica like a physical blow. Losing her job now would mean losing her apartment, losing her ability to care for Sophia, and losing everything she'd worked 8 years to build. The desperation in her voice was audible to nearby passengers as she responded into her radio. "Copy that, sir. Situation will be handled immediately." But handling the situation was easier said than done, especially when Richard Sterling decided this was the perfect moment to escalate his campaign of harassment against Amara to a completely new level. "You know what I think?" Richard announced loudly, standing up in first class so his voice would carry throughout the cabin. "I think we need to seriously look at suspicious behavior on this flight. That woman back there," he pointed directly at Amara, "has been acting strange all flight. Getting up constantly, wandering around, asking questions about the aircraft." The accusation was so outrageous and obviously fabricated that several passengers immediately looked uncomfortable. Amara had barely left her seat except to help Mrs. Henderson, but Richard's words were designed to plant seeds of fear in an already panicked cabin. "She was casing first class earlier," Richard continued, his voice growing more animated as he warmed to his theme. "Looking around, taking mental notes. In times like these, we can't be too careful about people who might have ulterior motives for being on this plane." The implications of Richard's words were crystal clear to everyone listening. He was suggesting that Amara might be some kind of security threat, using coded language that played on racial stereotypes and post-9/11 fears about aviation security. It was character assassination disguised as concerned citizenship. Other passengers began to murmur among themselves, and the mob mentality that Richard had been cultivating all flight finally began to take hold. Fear makes people susceptible to suggestion, and Richard's accusations found fertile ground in a cabin full of frightened travelers looking for someone to blame. "Now that he mentions it, she was asking a lot of questions," one passenger said. "And she did seem to know a lot about airline procedures," added another. "Maybe we should alert the crew," suggested a third. The whispered conversations grew louder, and suddenly Amara found herself the target of suspicious stares and pointed fingers from passengers who had been perfectly friendly just moments before. The transformation was as swift as it was unfair, but mob psychology had taken over rational thinking. Jessica watched this unfold with growing alarm, but also with a desperate calculation. Her supervisor had made it clear that her job depended on managing passenger complaints, and here was a cabin full of passengers rallying around Richard Sterling's concerns. If she supported Amara against the growing crowd, she might be seen as ignoring legitimate passenger safety concerns. The fatal decision that would haunt Jessica for the rest of her life came in this moment of desperation and fear. Instead of standing up for what was right, instead of protecting a passenger who had done nothing wrong, Jessica chose to side with the mob. "Ma'am," Jessica said, approaching Amara's seat with an authority she didn't feel, "I need you to return to your original seat and stop causing disruptions on this aircraft." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Amara looked up at Jessica with genuine confusion and hurt in her eyes. "I'm sorry, but I'm already in my assigned seat," Amara replied calmly. "I haven't left this row in over an hour. I'm not sure what disruptions you're referring to." But Jessica was too far gone to listen to reason. The pressure from her supervisor, the threat of losing her job, the mob of passengers watching her every move, and the emergency situation had combined to push her past the point of rational decision-making. "Ma'am, multiple passengers have complained about your behavior and suspicious activity on this flight," Jessica said, her voice getting louder and more aggressive. "I need you to comply with crew instructions immediately." Amara's response was a masterclass in grace under pressure. Despite being falsely accused in front of 200 people, despite being singled out for harassment based on nothing but prejudice, she maintained her composure and dignity. "I understand you're under a lot of stress with this emergency situation," Amara said softly, "but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I've been sitting quietly in my assigned seat, If there's a specific concern, perhaps we could discuss it privately." Her reasonable tone and obvious willingness to cooperate should have de-escalated the situation. Any rational person could see that Amara was being respectful, calm, and completely cooperative. But Jessica was no longer operating on rationality. "I've had enough of your attitude and disruptions," Jessica exploded, her voice rising to a shout that silenced conversations throughout the cabin. "You've been nothing but trouble since you boarded this aircraft." The entire cabin turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening, and phones began appearing as people started recording what they sensed was about to become a major incident. Amara, still maintaining her calm demeanor despite the public humiliation, tried one more time to defuse the situation. "I understand you're stressed, but there's no need to." The slap came without warning. Jessica's hand struck Amara across the face with a sharp crack that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The sound cut through every conversation, stopped every movement, and created a moment of absolute, stunned silence that seemed to last forever. 200 passengers sat in complete shock, unable to process what they had just witnessed. A flight attendant had just physically assaulted a passenger who had done nothing wrong. In full view of everyone on board, while the incident was being recorded on dozens of phones. The audible gasps that followed the slap created a wave of sound that rippled through the cabin. Passengers covered their mouths in horror, children began crying, and the reality of what had just happened began sinking in for everyone involved. Marcus, the young flight attendant, who had been struggling all day, was the first to break the silence. His face was pale with shock and horror as he rushed toward Amara. "Oh my God, are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking with emotion. "I am so sorry, that should never have happened. Are you hurt?" His genuine concern and immediate attempt to help stood in stark contrast to Jessica's actions and highlighted just how wrong the situation had become. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling sat back in his first-class seat with a look of smug satisfaction. His campaign of harassment had achieved exactly what he'd hoped for: a public humiliation of someone he considered beneath him. His expression showed no remorse, no concern for what had just happened, only the self-satisfied smile of someone who had successfully manipulated a situation to his advantage. Amara's response in this moment revealed everything about her character. Instead of screaming, instead of demanding justice, instead of escalating the situation further, she simply touched her cheek, where the slap had landed, and maintained her dignity in the face of absolute injustice. She said nothing. Not a word of anger, not a threat of legal action, not even a cry of pain. She simply sat back down in her seat with the quiet strength of someone who had faced adversity before, and knew that her character would be judged not by what was done to her, but by how she responded to it. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that cabin knew they had just witnessed something terrible, something that would have consequences far beyond this flight. The phones that had captured the incident were already uploading videos that would soon be viewed by millions, but none of the passengers yet understood the full magnitude of what they had just recorded. Jessica immediately realized she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The moment her hand struck Amara's face, she knew she had destroyed her career, her future, and possibly her ability to provide for her daughter. The desperation that had driven her to this moment was nothing compared to the horror she now felt at her own actions. But pride and fear prevented her from doing what she should have done in that moment. Instead of immediately apologizing, instead of acknowledging her terrible mistake, Jessica stood frozen in the aisle, unable to take back what she had done and too proud to admit she was wrong. The passengers around them were recording everything, capturing not just the slap itself, but also the aftermath. Jessica's lack of remorse, Amara's dignified response, and the shocked reactions of everyone who witnessed the assault. If you can believe it, this incredible story is about to get even more shocking. Make sure you subscribe, because what happens next will blow your mind and show you why you should never judge someone based on appearances. What would you have done if you were sitting on that plane and witnessed this assault? Would you have spoken up for Amara? Or would you have stayed silent like most of the passengers? Let us know in the comments, because this story is far from over. The videos being recorded in that moment were already beginning to upload as the plane prepared for its emergency landing. But no one on board had any idea that they had just witnessed the assault of someone who could change the entire airline industry with a single phone call. The truth about Amara Williams was about to come out, and when it did, everyone involved in this incident would discover that their assumptions about power, privilege, and justice were about to be turned completely upside down. In the tense silence that followed the slap heard around the cabin, no one noticed Amara Williams quietly reaching for her phone. While passengers whispered among themselves and Jessica stood frozen in the aftermath of her shocking assault, Amara made a phone call that would change everything for everyone on board Flight 447. Her voice was calm and measured, but those sitting close enough to hear could detect an undertone of steel that hadn't been there before. "David, it's me. We have a situation on Flight 447. The conversation was brief, professional, and spoken in the quiet tones of someone accustomed to handling crises. Most passengers paid no attention to what seemed like a routine phone call, but Marcus, who was still hovering nearby out of concern for Amara's welfare, caught enough of the conversation to feel a chill run down his spine. "Yes, I was physically assaulted by a crew member in front of 200 witnesses," Amara continued, her voice never rising above a conversational level. "The entire incident was recorded by multiple passengers. I need you to meet the plane when we land and bring the legal team." There was a pause as she listened to the response on the other end. "No, I'm fine, but this cannot be allowed to stand. We'll discuss the full response when you arrive." As Amara ended the call and quietly put her phone away, something began happening in the cockpit that would soon send ripples of confusion and concern throughout the aircraft. The captain, who had been focused on managing the emergency landing procedures, suddenly received a radio call that made him do a double take. "Flight 447. This is Williams Aviation Corporate Headquarters. You have priority landing clearance at Phoenix Sky Harbor. Ground crew and executive team will be standing by for immediate aircraft boarding upon arrival." This comes directly from ownership level. The captain stared at his radio in confusion. In 15 years of flying for Williams Aviation, he had never received a direct communication from corporate headquarters, let alone one mentioning ownership-level instructions. Emergency protocols were one thing, but this sounded like something much bigger was happening. "Williams Aviation Corporate, can you repeat that message?" the captain responded. "Did you say ownership level?" "Affirmative, Flight 447. This situation has been escalated to the highest levels of company management. Maintain current approach and expect immediate corporate response upon landing." In the cabin, Jessica noticed the unusual radio chatter between the cockpit and ground control. As a senior flight attendant with 8 years of experience, she was familiar with standard emergency landing procedures, but the increased communication and formal language being used suggested something far beyond a routine weather diversion. Marcus, who had been quietly observing everything since the slap incident, moved closer to Jessica with growing concern written across his young face. "Jessica," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the cabin noise, "I think we're in serious trouble. That woman Amara just made a phone call, and now there's all this corporate chatter on the radio. This doesn't feel like a normal emergency landing response." Jessica's first instinct was to dismiss Marcus's concerns. After all, he was new, inexperienced, and probably overreacting to standard procedures he didn't yet understand. But as she listened more carefully to the radio communications and observed the unusual level of activity, a seed of doubt began growing in her mind. Still, Jessica's pride and desperation wouldn't allow her to consider that she might have made a catastrophic mistake. In her mind, she had been maintaining order during a difficult situation, managing disruptive passengers, and following her supervisor's instructions to handle complaints immediately. Surely corporate would understand that she was just doing her job. As Flight 447 approached Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, passengers began noticing unusual activity on the ground below. Instead of the typical ground crew and service vehicles, The tarmac was filled with black SUVs, security personnel, and what appeared to be executives in expensive suits waiting on the runway. "Why are there so many cars down there?" one passenger asked nervously. "Is that normal for an emergency landing?" wondered another. The sight was so unusual that even Richard Sterling, who had been basking in his perceived victory over Amara, began to feel a twinge of uncertainty. This level of response seemed excessive for a simple weather diversion, but he quickly convinced himself that it was probably just standard corporate liability management. When the plane finally touched down and taxied to the gate, the unusual ground response became even more apparent. The aircraft was immediately surrounded by security vehicles, and a team of what were clearly high-level executives waited at the gate entrance. Jessica watched through the cabin windows with growing confusion, but she maintained her confidence. After all, she reasoned, she had been dealing with a disruptive passenger situation during an emergency. Corporate would surely support her professional decision-making, even if the response seemed a bit dramatic. "Probably just liability lawyers," Jessica muttered to Marcus, trying to convince herself as much as him. "Standard procedure when there's been an incident on board." But Marcus wasn't convinced. The scale of the corporate response, combined with Amara's mysterious phone call and her unusually calm demeanor throughout the entire ordeal, suggested something much bigger was happening. As the aircraft came to a complete stop and the engines wound down, the captain's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that sent shockwaves through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have been instructed that corporate executives will be boarding the aircraft before normal deplaning procedures begin. Thank you for your cooperation." The announcement was unprecedented. Passengers looked at each other with growing confusion and concern. Emergency landings were stressful enough, but having corporate executives board before passengers could leave was completely outside normal procedures. Richard Sterling, who had been confident in his position throughout the flight, began to feel the first real stirrings of unease. Something about this situation wasn't adding up, and the corporate response seemed far too intense for a simple passenger management issue. The aircraft door opened, and a stream of serious-looking executives in expensive suits began boarding the plane. Leading the group was a distinguished Asian-American man in his early 50s, followed by what were clearly lawyers carrying briefcases and tablets. But it was the demeanor of these executives that truly alarmed the passengers. These weren't airline employees coming to smooth over a minor incident. These were people responding to a crisis of the highest magnitude, and their faces showed the gravity of whatever situation they were addressing. The lead executive, David Chen, moved through the cabin with the authority of someone accustomed to handling corporate emergencies. His eyes swept the cabin, taking in the scene, before settling on Jessica with a look that made her blood run cold. "Ladies and gentlemen," David Chen announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "I am David Chen, Chief Executive Officer of Williams Aviation. I need to address a serious incident that occurred on this flight involving our owner, Miss Amara Williams." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Jessica felt the color drain from her face as the implications of what she had just heard began to sink in. Owner. The woman she had slapped, the woman she had publicly humiliated and assaulted, was the owner of the airline. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin as passengers began to understand the magnitude of what they had witnessed. The quiet woman in jeans and a sweater, the woman who had been helping elderly passengers and encouraging nervous crew members, was not just another passenger. She owned the airline. She owned the plane. She owned everything. Richard Sterling's face went from smug satisfaction to absolute horror as the reality hit him. All of his loud complaints about certain types of people, all of his accusations about suspicious behavior, all of his inflammatory rhetoric had been directed at the woman who literally owned the company he was flying with. Meanwhile, Amara Williams stood up in her seat with the quiet dignity that had characterized her behavior throughout the entire ordeal. There was no smugness in her expression, no satisfaction at the revelation of her identity. She simply stood with the grace of someone who had faced adversity and injustice with integrity intact. David Chen continued his announcement, and every word felt like another nail in Jessica's professional coffin. Miss Williams inherited Williams Aviation 3 months ago, following the death of her father, Marcus Williams, the company's founder. This airline, this aircraft, and every employee on this plane ultimately answered to her. The cabin fell into complete silence as the full scope of the situation became clear. Jessica had not just assaulted a passenger, she had assaulted her ultimate boss. She had not just made a career-ending mistake, she had attacked the one person who could destroy not just her job, but potentially the entire careers of everyone involved. Richard Sterling's horrified realization played out across his face like a slow-motion car crash. Every racist comment, every inflammatory accusation, every moment of harassment had been directed at the woman who could ban him from flying with this airline forever. His business travel, his status, his entire relationship with the company was now in jeopardy because of his own prejudice and arrogance. But it was Jessica's world that was truly crumbling in real time. As the reality of what she had done sank in, she began to understand that this wasn't just about losing her job. She had physically assaulted the owner of a major airline in front of 200 witnesses, with the entire incident recorded on multiple phones that were probably already uploading to social media. The financial implications alone were staggering. The legal consequences could be devastating. The media attention would be overwhelming. And through it all, her 8-year-old daughter Sophia would have to watch her mother become the face of workplace violence and discrimination. Marcus, the young flight attendant who had tried to help Amara throughout the ordeal, looked between his colleague and the executives with growing understanding. His instincts had been right. Amara Williams hadn't just been another passenger. She had been the most important passenger they would ever serve, and she had been treated with contempt, prejudice, and ultimately violence. The other passengers sat in stunned silence, many of them replaying their own behavior during the flight and wondering what consequences they might face for their participation in the mob mentality that had led to this moment. David Chen's presence on the aircraft sent a clear message that this incident would not be swept under the rug or handled quietly. The full weight of corporate justice was about to come down on everyone involved, and the consequences would be swift, severe, and very public. The revelation had transformed Flight 447 from a routine commercial flight into the scene of what would soon become one of the most significant airline incidents in recent history. And as the passengers sat in shocked silence, they began to realize that they had all been witnesses to a moment that would change how the aviation industry handled discrimination and passenger treatment forever. The quiet woman in coach had revealed herself to be the most powerful person on the plane. And now everyone would discover exactly what justice looked like when it came from the very top of the corporate hierarchy. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and David Chen's presence on Flight 447 meant that justice would be swift, decisive, and witnessed by everyone who had participated in or observed the shocking events of this flight. What happened next would demonstrate that when true leadership faces discrimination and injustice, the consequences are both immediate and transformative. David Chen moved through the cabin with the authority of someone who had built his career on making difficult decisions under pressure. As CEO of Williams Aviation, he had dealt with countless crises, but never one that involved a physical assault on the company's owner by her own employee. His face was stern, professional, and absolutely resolute as he prepared to address the immediate consequences of what had transpired. Jessica Martinez, David Chen announced, his voice carrying throughout the silent cabin, "Your employment with Williams Aviation is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from this aircraft, and you will be banned from all company property pending potential criminal charges for assault." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. But she had known this moment was coming from the instant David Chen revealed Amara's identity. 8 years of building her career, 8 years of perfect attendance and professional service, 8 years of working toward financial stability for herself and her daughter, all destroyed in a single moment of poor judgment and unchecked prejudice. But David Chen wasn't finished. His attention turned to Richard Sterling, who had been sitting in first class with growing horror as he realized the magnitude of his own role in creating this catastrophic situation. "Mr. Richard Sterling," David Chen continued, "your behavior on this flight constitutes passenger harassment and discrimination. Security will also escort you from this aircraft. You are hereby banned from flying with Williams Aviation or any of our partner airlines. Your frequent flyer status is permanently revoked, and your corporate travel account has been suspended." Richard Sterling's face went from pale to ashen as the full implications of his punishment became clear. As a business consultant who traveled extensively for work, being banned from a major airline and its partners would effectively cripple his career. The racist comments and inflammatory accusations he had made in his moment of perceived power were now costing him everything he had worked to build in his professional life. But David Chen's attention wasn't limited to the two primary antagonists. His gaze swept the cabin, taking in the faces of passengers who had participated in the mob mentality that had made Amara's humiliation possible. To the passengers who joined in the harassment and false accusations against Ms. Williams, David Chen announced, his voice carrying a stern warning, "You will each receive formal notices regarding your future travel privileges with this airline. Discrimination and mob behavior will not be tolerated on our aircraft, regardless of your ticket class or frequent flyer status." The passengers who had been so eager to pile on with Richard Sterling's accusations now sat in mortified silence, realizing that their participation in the harassment would have lasting consequences. Several passengers who had been filming the incident and nodding along with Richard's rhetoric now understood that their own behavior had been recorded and would be reviewed by corporate security teams. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen, the young, nervous flight attendant who had struggled throughout the flight but had consistently shown kindness and professionalism, found himself at the center of an unexpected announcement. "Marcus Chen," David said, turning to the young man with the first smile anyone had seen from him since boarding the aircraft. "Your behavior during this difficult situation demonstrates exactly the kind of character and professionalism we value at Williams Aviation. Effective immediately, you are promoted to senior flight attendant, with the corresponding pay increase and benefits package." Marcus's face showed complete shock at this unexpected turn of events. In a single moment, he had gone from being a nervous newcomer worried about making mistakes to being recognized and rewarded for his integrity and compassion. The promotion would change his life, providing the job security and financial stability that every young professional dreams of achieving. The immediate consequences had been delivered with corporate efficiency, but what happened next would reveal the true character of Amara Williams and demonstrate why her father had chosen her to inherit not just his business empire, but his philosophy of leadership through service. As security personnel prepared to escort Jessica and Richard from the aircraft, Amara Williams did something that no one expected. She stood up and approached David Chen with a quiet request that surprised everyone in the cabin. "David, before Miss Martinez leaves, I'd like to speak with her privately for a moment." David Chen looked at Amara with concern and confusion. "Ma'am, given what happened, I don't think that's advisable. We have security protocols." 2 minutes, Amara said firmly but gently. "Just 2 minutes." The CEO nodded reluctantly, and Amara approached Jessica, who was standing in the aisle with tears streaming down her face and her entire body shaking with the magnitude of what she had lost. The other passengers watched in stunned silence as the woman who had been assaulted chose to approach her attacker with what appeared to be compassion rather than anger. When Amara spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only Jessica and the nearest passengers could hear, but her words carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire cabin. "Jessica, I know you're struggling financially," Amara said, her voice soft but clear. "I heard your phone call about your rent, about your daughter needing medicine. That doesn't excuse what happened here today, but I understand desperation. I understand what it feels like when you're drowning and you'll grab onto anything to stay afloat, even if it means pulling someone else under. Jessica looked up at Amara through her tears, unable to comprehend why the woman she had wronged so badly was showing her any kindness at all. The cognitive dissonance between her expectations and reality was overwhelming. "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered, her voice breaking with genuine remorse. "I'm so sorry. I was scared of losing my job, scared of not being able to take care of Sophia, and I made the worst decision of my life. There's no excuse for what I did to you." Amara studied Jessica's face for a long moment, seeing not just the flight attendant who had assaulted her, but the desperate mother who had made a terrible choice under impossible pressure. What she offered next would shock everyone listening and demonstrate the kind of leadership that transforms not just companies, but entire industries. "Jessica, I'm going to give you a choice," Amara said, her voice carrying the authority of ownership, combined with the compassion of someone who understood human frailty. "You can accept the termination, face the public humiliation that's coming when these videos go viral, and deal with the potential legal consequences of assault. That's the path of justice, and you've earned every bit of it." Jessica nodded, accepting that this was exactly what she deserved for her actions. "Or," Amara continued, "you can choose a different path. You can spend the next year working with our diversity and sensitivity training program, not as an employee, but as someone who helps us teach other airline workers about the real consequences of discrimination and prejudice. You'll tell your story, own your mistakes, and help make sure this never happens to anyone else." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, and so far beyond what Jessica deserved that she could barely process what she was hearing. Instead of jail time and lawsuits, she was being offered a chance at redemption, a chance to turn her worst moment into something that could help others. "The pay would be enough to cover your rent and your daughter's medical expenses," Amara continued. "But you'd have to face what you did every single day. You'd have to tell room after room of airline employees about the moment you let fear and prejudice turn you into someone you never wanted to be. You'd have to look at pictures of your own assault on another human being and explain to others how it happened." Jessica was sobbing now, overwhelmed by both the magnitude of her mistake and the incredible grace being shown to her by the woman she had wronged. "I know this is hard to understand," Amara said, placing a gentle hand on Jessica's shoulder, "but I've learned something important from my father's teachings. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show people a different way forward. Sometimes mercy creates more change than punishment ever could." Jessica looked up at Amara with wonder and gratitude that went beyond words. "Why would you do this for me? After what I did to you?" Amara's response carried the wisdom of someone who had learned leadership from a master teacher. "Because everyone has a story you don't know, Jessica. Everyone is fighting battles you can't see. I could destroy you completely, and it would be justified. But destroying you doesn't help your daughter, doesn't help other employees who might face similar pressures, and doesn't make the airline industry better for anyone." She paused, looking directly into Jessica's eyes with complete sincerity. "Treat people with dignity, Jessica. Everyone you meet is carrying burdens you can't imagine. Everyone deserves to be seen as a full human being, regardless of what they look like, where they come from, or what seat they're sitting in. That's the lesson I hope you'll help us teach others." Jessica's breakdown was complete now, but it was a breakdown that came from overwhelming gratitude rather than despair. Through her tears, she managed to whisper, "I'll take the training program. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Amara nodded and stepped back, allowing security to escort Jessica from the aircraft. But as Jessica reached the door, she turned back one more time. "Miss Williams," Jessica called out, her voice carrying throughout the cabin, "I promise you that I'll spend every day for the rest of my life making sure other people understand the choice between fear and compassion. Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like." As Jessica left the aircraft, the passengers sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. They had expected to see corporate vengeance and legal destruction. Instead, they had seen mercy, wisdom, and a form of justice that sought transformation rather than simply punishment. Richard Sterling's removal from the aircraft was far less dramatic but equally final. Unlike Jessica, he showed no remorse, no understanding of his role in creating the crisis, and no willingness to acknowledge the harm his prejudice had caused. He left the plane muttering about lawsuits and unfair treatment, completely unable to see that his own actions had created every consequence he now faced. With the immediate crisis resolved and the principal actors removed, Amara Williams turned her attention to the remaining passengers. What she said next would become the defining moment, not just of this flight, but of her leadership of Williams Aviation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Amara said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin, "I want to address what happened here today, not as the owner of this airline, but as a fellow human being who has experienced both the best and worst of how we treat each other." The passengers listened with rapt attention, many of them still processing their own role in the events that had unfolded. "What you witnessed today wasn't just about one flight attendant making a poor decision or one passenger expressing his prejudices," Amara continued. "What you saw was what happens when fear, stress, and bias combine to create a perfect storm of injustice, and many of you contributed to that storm." Her words were direct, but not accusatory, holding people accountable while still offering the possibility of learning and growth. "I've spent the last 3 months learning everything I can about the airline industry, about leadership, and about the responsibility that comes with power. And here's what I've learned. The measure of a company, the measure of a leader, and the measure of a society isn't how they treat the people who look like them, think like them, or can benefit them. It's how they treat the people who can't fight back, who don't have power, who are different from them." She paused, looking around the cabin at faces that showed shame, understanding, and hope in equal measure. "My father taught me that leadership means serving others first. It means creating systems and cultures where everyone is treated with dignity, regardless of their background, their appearance, or their circumstances. It means standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it costs you something." Marcus, who was now officially the senior flight attendant, listened to every word with growing understanding of what it meant to work for a leader rather than just a boss. From this day forward, Williams Aviation will be implementing new training programs, new policies, and new accountability measures to ensure that what happened today never happens again, Amara announced. "But more than that, we're going to become an airline that actively promotes dignity, respect, and understanding in everything we do." She gestured toward Marcus, who was standing nearby with a mixture of pride and nervousness at his new responsibilities. "Marcus will complete this flight as your senior attendant, and I have complete confidence that he'll demonstrate the kind of service and professionalism that represents the best of what we can be as an industry." Marcus straightened his shoulders and moved forward to take charge of the cabin service, his earlier nervousness replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had been recognized for doing the right thing. As the flight continued to its final destination, something remarkable happened. The passengers who remained on the aircraft began engaging with each other differently. Conversations started between people who would normally never speak. Passengers helped each other with bags without being asked. The elderly Mrs. Henderson, who had been helped by Amara earlier in the flight, made a point of thanking Marcus for his kindness. The transformation wasn't complete. Change never happens that quickly. But the seeds of something better had been planted. People who had witnessed the power of prejudice had also witnessed the greater power of mercy and moral leadership. When Flight 447 finally landed in Los Angeles, the passengers deplaned with a different understanding of what it meant to treat each other with dignity. Many of them would go on to share their stories, not just about the shocking assault they had witnessed, but about the incredible grace and leadership they had seen in response to it. The videos of the slap had indeed gone viral, but they were quickly overshadowed by videos of Amara's response, her offer of redemption to Jessica, and her speech about dignity and respect. The incident became a case study in business schools about crisis management and moral leadership. Jessica Martinez did indeed spend the next year working with Williams Aviation's diversity training program. Her presentations became some of the most powerful and effective tools for teaching airline employees about the real-world consequences of discrimination. She and her daughter Sophia never missed another rent payment, and Jessica eventually became one of the most respected voices in the industry for promoting dignity and respect in customer service. Marcus Chen thrived in his new role and eventually became a trainer himself, helping other young flight attendants understand that kindness and professionalism weren't just company policies. They were moral imperatives that could change lives. Richard Sterling faced the consequences of his actions in both his professional and personal life. Without access to his preferred airlines, his consulting business suffered dramatically. More importantly, the videos of his harassment and racist comments followed him everywhere, serving as a permanent reminder that prejudice always has consequences. But perhaps the most significant change was in Amara Williams herself. The incident on Flight 447 transformed her from someone who had inherited a business into someone who truly understood the responsibility that came with power. She spent the following years turning Williams Aviation into the most respected airline in the industry for customer service, employee treatment, and social responsibility. The story of Flight 447 became legend in the aviation industry, but its lessons extended far beyond airlines. It became a powerful reminder that everyone you meet is fighting battles you can't see, carrying burdens you can't imagine, and deserving of dignity, regardless of their circumstances. Sometimes the person you least expect to have power is the one who deserves it most. Amara Williams didn't just inherit an airline that day, she inherited the responsibility to make flying better for everyone. And through her response to one of the worst moments in aviation customer service history, she demonstrated that true leadership isn't about wielding power over others, but about using power to lift others up. The quiet woman in Coach had revealed herself to be exactly the kind of leader the world needs more of. Someone who understands that mercy is not weakness, that dignity is not optional, and that the true measure of character is how you treat people when you have every right to destroy them. What would you have done in Amara's position? Would you have chosen mercy over vengeance, understanding over punishment? If this incredible story of transformation and redemption moved you, make sure to subscribe, because there are more amazing stories of justice and human dignity coming your way. Let us know in the comments from where you watching, and what you think about Amara's decision to offer Jessica a second chance instead of pursuing full legal action.